So, I was still in the process of working on my Incel video when this bombshell dropped. I was curious, so I called up a few friends of mine to share with them in the undoubtedly colorful experiences that this video was promising us, and even though given his previous record we were not expecting much, what we witnessed managed to underperform even our lowest expectations. This sin against every accepted scientific methodology is titled The Coming Incel Revolution by Whatifalthist, a 40-minute long unhinged rant about a topic that he doesn't really understand. For those unfamiliar with his work, Whatifalthist was once an alternative history YouTube channel who ever since basically transformed into a right-wing influencer, and one of the worst kinds actually. There's an entire subgenre on YouTube of people dunking on his poorly researched videos, and you will see what I mean when you dig deeper into this very video. I hope you do. Please do. Thanks. Now, in this long 40 minutes, we have experienced a wide range of emotions going from joy to confusion to anger to complete and utter disbelief at the nonsense we were witnessing. Granted, I don't know much about Whatifalthist's personal qualities, so I can't really make a statement about them, but his work is a disaster that I'm intimately familiar with. In this supposedly short follow-up video that became much longer than I originally anticipated, I will go through some of the most egregious nonsense he placed out here for all of us to lose brain cells on. This is sadly not only present in this video, as many of these problems that I will talk about are actually quite common in his poorly researched and even more poorly produced videos. Like, come on, man, you have been on YouTube for more than a decade at this point. How could you stagnate so badly? But I digress. I will not go over every single mistake, but I will most definitely highlight the most common and major problems that basically everything he says harbor. This doesn't mean that here and there he can't make the occasional good point, but the examples of that are getting ever thinner by the day. I have a sore throat and I haven't managed to sleep for a while now, so let's get this over with. Before we move on, I have to very sternly warn anyone who listens to this video. Do not, under any circumstances, personally harass him or threaten him. If you do any of that, you are worse than whatever evils you imagine him to be. I neither support it nor condone it. If I see or hear about it, I will denounce it, because that is not what I stand for, and that is not what you should stand for. Are we clear? Alright, let's move on. Let's start with the basics. Watching his video, I have started having the sneaking suspicion that him not knowing what he's talking about extends to such basics as what an incel actually is. Okay, there is a degree of subjectivity about what an incel is, and even self-proclaimed incels disagree about it sometimes. I will present my idea of what an incel is based on my personal years-long so-called research into the topic, which among other things included partially a lot of personal interviews and partially on what incels say about it themselves. Both of these have their own fair share of problems, of course, like how my share of knowledge might be subjective and how certain groups being in charge of how others should perceive them obviously have a vested interest in presenting themselves in a certain fashion, and different groups might disagree on this. It is also to be mentioned that not everyone is the same and ideas might differ. Cool? Cool. I will also not go through everything here, I'm already producing a video focusing on that, but broadly speaking, inceldom and incels in a modern context tend to refer to a specific online subculture/community of mostly men who are unsuccessful in having relationships, be it casual or long-term. Incel is a very specific mindset, focusing on loneliness, nihilism, and hatred, and increasingly inceldom emerges as a specific subset of ideas, ideologies, and beliefs, most prominently the black pill, a long and completely unhinged rabbit hole I will not go into detail for now. Incels are distinct from the online manosphere, pickup artistry, and red pill content, the likes of Andrew Tate, for example, and his acolytes. These groups interact at points and intersect at points, but are not the same. To be very general, the only thing common in the two is sexism. But while red pillars usually are either grifters or scammers preying on young men or preaching of wide-ranging topics with toxic and sexist ideals about society and masculinity, incels' main focus is that they can't get laid. Though there is a pipeline, incels more or less hate these people and often point to their success as evidence to justify their own views about women and the so-called Chad. Whatifalthist seems to confuse the two.
The incel revolution would be led by Chads who would gather incel soldiers to fight for them.
This is but one of many examples why I think Whatifalthist gravely misunderstands the issue at hand. Incels more often than not despise and envy their idea of Chad, who takes all their women from them and who are the proof that their misogynistic ideas are true and women are indeed superficial and go for the upper 10% of guys. Also, he seems contradictory multiple times, like how
I'm pretty satisfied with my romantic options right now, and I'm just not an incel.
Which incels are absolutely not, and talking about incels as a separate group, but sometimes refer to them as
women tend to just do less activities than men. Most young women just go to work and then go home. Homath then said one of the most blackpilling things in my life, with, I guess there's nowhere anymore.
He doesn't seem to conclude without a reasonable doubt if he himself is an incel or not. I think he might be thinking himself as a Chad, I guess, who will lead the incel revolution.
I have a team which works for me. I live in my own house. I make over 6 figures a year. I drive an Audi, and I'm 6'4" tall. I have a large social network, have founded 8 different social clubs, including one for professional influencers at one point.
And in his case, as opposed to incels, who mostly think that they are unable to get women because of how women are superficial and they are, like, ugly, in his case, he just thinks that the whole reason is just feminism, and if he can just change that, then he will get a girlfriend. I don't know if it's true or not, it just seems like it a lot of the times. Regardless, he also on several occasions can't agree if an incel is just a term for lonely or single young man or the community with its distinct ideology. They are, in my opinion, not interchangeable, and incel specifically means the community and individuals in it, and not lonely young men in general. He also does parrot ideological talking points he seemingly directly took from IncelWiki, a site managed by one of the most prominent surface web incel forums, full of its own terrible nonsense, but he honestly feels like an outsider whenever he talks about it, who can't decide where he stands exactly, as I've mentioned. For now, at least, I think Whatifalthist is more of a red pillar right-wing pundit than an actual black pillar incel. Or he just doesn't know what he's talking about. Speaking of not knowing what he's talking about, let's get the most obvious Whatifalthist sin out of the way. Whatifalthist is notoriously terrible when it comes to sourcing. His long list of books in his video descriptions, beside being not the correct way to reference books in any work whatsoever, offer no insight into the most points and completely neglect to mention the numerous studies and statistics he is allegedly building his arguments on. It is no secret that his views are pretty much entirely vibe-based, full of his personal biases, things that he would swear to sky and land he can avoid.
As a tangent, one of the things which annoys me is that people appeal to authenticity, or this emotionally feels right, thus it's moral and good.
He several times refers to studies and articles that allegedly prove his points. The problem is that he either never cites them or throws in screen caps into the background kind of haphazardly and leaves it at that.
In statistically most cases, this is just because the woman got bored. From studies, we've found that 90% of the population just rationalizes whatever their emotional state is.
And those studies that can be traced back are bad. Like, after looking a little bit deeper into it, to my complete lack of surprise, I found garbage of such levels that I honestly started to understand why he never fucking cites his sources, because I too would be completely embarrassed to publicly acknowledge I used this shite as a source. Among other things, and as I've mentioned already, he used IncelWiki, a site managed by Incel.is, one of the largest surface web incel forums, and a site that is also notorious for conspiracy theories and advocating for violence. For example, the part where he talks about dating apps and Tinder, specifically about how if Tinder would be a country, then it would be one of the most unequal places on earth.
The first being the dating apps. which on a systematic level massively destroy the dating balance between men and women. What occurs here is that since it makes it incredibly easy for men to reach women, and women are naturally very picky, is that you end up with horrifying inequality. If Tinder, the biggest dating app, was a country, it would be the second most unequal in the world, behind South Africa and ahead of Venezuela. Tinder also filters for the most shallow thing, looks, and women tend to be even pickier on looks, while things like personality, game, or social class act as equalizers. Thus, what happens here is the top 10% of men sleep with the top 40% of women. Meanwhile, the bottom 80% of men get basically absolutely nothing from the dating apps, while the top 20% of men gets almost all of the women. This creates a giant class of dissatisfied men, while most women compete for a small group of men who have no interest in dating them.
That is specifically from a particularly unhinged medium.com blog article originally cited in an Incel.is page. He even stole grabs from there, come on. The article itself, which I will put into the description, is an unhinged and misogynistic rant that somehow quantifies attractiveness, a completely unquantifiable and subjective thing, through a shitty alpha male website, and set up a fake profile that asked 27 women who they tended to like. Based on this highly sophisticated and scientific calculation conducted on a site that has a gender ratio of roughly 55 men to 25 women, which already heavily skews the outlook of anything taken from there, every single woman on planet Earth go for the top 20% of men, whatever the fuck that means. You can see for yourself, it's in the description. There are also other examples, like when these sources proclaimed a certain John Haidt as the greatest scientist in his field.
We've found through studies where John Haidt is the greatest expert on this topic.
And when some computer scientist dudes predicted certain already happened events with a model.
We have a bunch of metrics which we use to assess when societies have revolutions.
Which, without the actual model, is a completely useless finding. He never cites his fucking sources. Also the patriarchal revolutions, which I still genuinely don't know what those are.
And if you look over history, you find that there are patriarchal waves roughly every 500 years.
Additionally, he mentions your run-of-the-mill red pill woman and feminist epically owned YouTuber like Alexander Grace, whose entire YouTube existence seemed to be nothing more than following the traditional online misogynistic manosphere content, and Home Math, which was honestly one of the most pathetic channels I've ever seen. Like, look at this nonsense. Look at it. I'm honestly baffled that anyone can see this and not immediately notice the giant red flags floating around, let alone take any of this seriously. And on the note of dubious sources, let's take a look at the data itself. Oh my god, where do I even begin with this one? Okay, so basically, the video mostly contained two kinds of data. One was either complete nonsense, as I have shown before, or taken completely out of context and presented in a shallow and superficial manner, never actually examining it closer, merely being tossed in to justify an already existing worldview. Let's talk about that Pew Research data that he referenced to illustrate my point.
2/3 of young men are single. Well, I think for guys my age, and I'm 22, the numbers are probably around 80%. The thing is that these are the kinds of numbers which people tend to feel sensitive about or cope with. In the same manner that young men are lonely and single, it's also true of young women, albeit not as bad, with only half of young women being single as young men.
So, as you can see here in this sad picture that was presented by Whatifalthist in his video about how 63% of young men were single in 2022. Not a good thing, but for entirely other reasons that he might suggest. Here I will link two articles from the Pew Research Center, one from 2020 and the other from 2023, to make a point. Incels often like to use this and similar stuff to justify their nonsense about how the majority of young men are incels because the majority of them are single. Short answer is no. The longer is, well, long, so here is a medium length. First of all, define single. Pew Research Center usually defines being single as someone that is not married, living with a partner, or in a committed romantic relationship. The foxy ones among my audience might have spotted that this is not the same as being unable to get laid or get a girlfriend. This absolutely lobs everyone that is not in a long-term, traditional, committed relationship with someone else into a single category. Single. Besides Whatifalthist not accounting for the rise and advent of hookup culture, short-term and non-traditional relationships not accounted for here, he also completely glosses over people in question, like the fact that around half of single adults in the US are not actively looking for a long-term relationship. He also ignores how women and men are single at largely the same rate, around 30%, being single in both groups, albeit in somewhat different age demographics. Young men between the ages of 18 and 29 are the most affected, with 51 to 63% of being single compared to 31 to 34% of young women, respectively, in the articles that I've posted. However, keeping in mind that what I've just said about the characteristics of single people and how casual relationships are in particular a prominent thing among young men, I want to add another crucial detail, which is that the average age upon which people settle. On average, women settle in their late 20s and men in their early 30s. Adding to this that on average in a relationship men tend to be older than their women counterparts, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where the devil lies here. No wonder people in their 30s are the least single. People are often in no rush to immediately settle, either due to personal or financial reasons. For example, because many social constraints around relationship were eased in recent times, or because they want to build their careers first. Not every single young man is about to launch a revolution to delete women's rights because they are single. Some are just occupied with their careers. Some don't want a relationship for one reason or another. People are sometimes just complicated. That's all. Look, I'm not saying that there is no mental health and social crisis eating into the youth of today. Far from it. In fact, that is something that me and Whatifalthist probably agree on. The nature of this is, however, something we don't really see eye to eye on. And this is just one example of how he doesn't present the full picture. I could also mention how he just flat out lies into our face about the very data that he placed in front of us, where he just says that the most common reason for divorce is the woman getting bored.
In statistically most cases, this is just because the woman got bored.
Using basic incompatibility as a source for that, and also skipping over things like partner cheating and domestic violence, both of these done mostly by men. Not going into any detail to explain how exactly divorce proceedings end the way they do. Spoiler, what he says there is a huge oversight at best and an egregious lie at worst. And completely ignoring the more nuanced picture of divorce, like how women are less forced to remain in broken marriages. But he does covertly rant against women having the right to terminate a marriage for no fault. Whatifalthist, come on, you're better than this, man. Or should I call you Rudyard, if that is how it is pronounced, because I don't actually know. And before anyone claims such a thing, I'm not trying to downplay domestic abuse, violence, and sexual assault that happens against men, because it does happen. We should absolutely discuss it. We should absolutely put more effort into helping the victims and taking them more seriously. But somehow blaming women for the whole thing, for everything that happens around us, that it's somehow women's fault that these things happen, is just not true. And discussing women's rights issues do not mean that we marginalize men's issues. Like, just because women become more equal doesn't mean that men will become less or are less. That is just nonsense. But I digress. The next item on the chopping block is the Mouse Utopia experiment, which he also didn't source properly and was presented dishonestly, in my opinion.
One of the few valid arguments against this point stems from the Mouse Utopia video. This is a long enough argument where I can't get into here, but read this text wall for more information. Basically, the nihilism and degeneracy of modern culture is unprecedented. A study on mice from 1960s and 70s, which gave them perfect conditions for population growth, which then resulted in seeing their society fall apart, had very similar and scary conditions to the modern world. The thing is, the mice grew effeminate and weak. They stopped breeding. An important thing to think about, and the best argument against this to steelman the case, is that if you look at Mouse Utopia, the mice had rapid declines in male hormones like testosterone, similar to what we're seeing in the Western world today among men. And I feel kind of nervous saying stuff like this because when you give someone 5 options and a single out, they'll often immediately jump on the out without thinking as a way to not deal with the issue. But perhaps due to Mouse Utopia, young men are too weak to actually fight. That being said, knowing young men, I don't think that's actually the case. That being said, if young men don't stand up for their position, even on a peaceful basis, our mouse colony is doomed, as procreation and society will fall apart. What happened in every single version of the Mouse Utopia experiment was that the colony totally failed, collapsing down to 0. Gangs of evil mice killed those who continued to procreate. This is the equivalent of the antenatal governments pushing various degrowth policies which crash the birth rate so much so that society goes extinct.
Especially the findings that completely shoehorn into the Incel metaphor, even using alleged conclusions that I struggle to actually find in the original documents, which I will link in the description, by the way, as you should also do it, Whatifalthist. There were also several experiments, both with mice and rats. And besides neglecting to mention this, he also neglected to mention that the applicability to human society was always called into question, and that there were human experiments that tried to create similar conditions and produced completely different results. I'm not doubting that it was important research, I'm doubting the conclusions that Whatifalthist took from it. There is also the part where he basically interchangeably uses dating apps with online dating. Dating apps are a subgroup in online dating. The thing is, what he fails to mention is that the world around us digitalizes, and especially during and after the pandemic, more social interactions happened online. People started hanging out there more, meeting more people, and inevitably forming relationships there. Like, based on this, I was, for the most part, a single man between the ages of 18 and 29 who met basically all his partners online. None in dating apps, by the way. And on this personal note, everybody has personal biases. Me, you, Whatifalthist, everybody. However, when you are trying to talk about complex societal occurrences, it is best to leave your personal subjective biases and experiences at the door as much as possible and not use them as evidence to society-wide things, because you will find yourself in the situation where our hero did. That is, using his subjective personal experiences as proof for claims on society-wide things, be it his political biases, in which he doesn't actually understand how politics and politicians work, or his obliviousness on employment in corporations. You can find all kinds of flavors. He often presents himself like he has actual in-depth knowledge. However, more often than not, he doesn't actually have more than surface-level understanding of the topic in question, if even that. Let's go with the corporate example first.
One of the things I find shocking in my own personal network and with my personal projects is the insane level of quality I can get. I'll be working with people and think, I don't really have the money to pay you for this, but you should be the CEO of a company or working for the government's foreign policy. Instead, you're doing a project with the Whatifalthist guy since society stopped hiring white men. There is a giant class of obscenely competent young men who are dissatisfied and have nothing better to do.
Based on what he says, I heavily doubt that he has extensive experience with corporate jobs. First and foremost, the standards and types of work required for an average video of his is probably not even the same league as a corporation, for example. They're just not applicable. Another example of this nonsense is
I compared the oppression of young white men in the Western world to literal conquered nations, like the Irish under English colonialism, and found the only difference to be that the Irish weren't allowed to vote or own property, while modern whites can. This also includes job hiring, in which 95% of new jobs created since COVID in major companies have gone to minorities.
One which is complete bogus. Non-Hispanic white people in the US, for example, are one of the least unemployed group, only taken over by Asians with 0.3%. He feels like white men are somehow oppressed. He makes numerous mentions of it too, like how it feels like that they are literally under the boot of a foreign invader, but he never provides any functioning examples. Want to know a personal example of what it is like? My granddad had to flee the country after Soviet soldiers invaded us in 1956, dismantled our government and murdered thousands of people. He would have been jailed or worse if he went home. Only years later he was able to return. That is what it feels like to be literally under the boot of a foreign invader. Aye. Entitlement or victim complex. Whatever you might name it, it is just the same. They want to be victims. They feel like victims. They feel like that because of the fantasy world that they have built around themselves, where they are simultaneously the most oppressed and simultaneously most powerful group on planet Earth. He also talks about how almost all new jobs go to everyone but the non-Hispanic white people. Yeah, because they, and by extension you, are one of the richest and most employed group in the country, you dingus! Often, marginalized communities are impoverished and tend to lose their jobs at a higher rate during a crisis. Naturally, they will be the ones who take up the new openings. It is also present in a lot of background text that he wrote, where he goes on and on about the best things to do to have a relationship and what society, quote-unquote, supposedly tells women to do, again not showing anything to prove or underline these claims, and even having the audacity to lecture women about how they should be.
However, even with all these expectations piled on men, women aren't expected to reciprocate with any effort on their part. Something which my male brain has trouble empathizing with, although I know on an evolutionary basis why women are like this, is that telling young women to keep a healthy weight, not be promiscuous, and to not be socially annoying is just objectively good advice if they want to get a good man. And we constantly do the male equivalent, as I said before, but if you're offended at people saying that stuff, you're just offended by reality. For women in my audience, please be very, very careful in the future. To be clear, I'm not saying this is a threat, but out of genuine concern for what I think will be something truly horrible. And the great irony is that for me just expressing this concern, I will undoubtedly be called a evil misogynist, which is just ironic.
Funniest things about one such text is basically him complaining that he can't sleep around and cheat around in the same social circle because people would notice and call him out on it. Things like this are why I called his worldview vibe-based. His views are not evidence-driven, but whatever he feels like driven. Given his lackluster sourcing and his wall of vaguely related books improperly tossed into the description, it is not at all surprising that our champion of facts and logic is actually none of those. If we take what he says in his videos, and I don't just mean this Incel video, but in general, he is often mis- or underinformed about the topics in question, but he has a very concrete and strong opinion about them. To put it bluntly, how he personally feels about what things look like influences his arguments much more than any fact. He often builds what we may call strawman non-arguments, points to nondescript large groups that might not even have anything in common, and proclaims that they stand for something, and then he proceeds to agree or disagree with it. Examples include when he said,
"This is obviously true for the left in general today, which is philosophically literally said that logical consistency is white male oppression."
The left, a famously completely homogeneous group not at all known to wide-ranging infighting, said the logical consistency is white male oppression. This just simply doesn't make any sense. There is no the left, just ask two leftists about it, and I would struggle to find any such widely accepted statement by people who are claiming to be leftist. Or the other was that
the thing which shocks me is how much the left gloats over its victory, removing young men from all culture, with Google Gemini as a great example, not hiring almost any young men, or basically making humiliation rituals in the education or corporate system. If you're a wise conqueror, don't gloat in your victory too much, since you derive no benefit from it and you want the conquered to cooperate.
Ah yes, big corporations and the left, famous brothers in arms. Come on, comrade billion-dollar corporation, let's install feminazi oppression against young men. This extends basically, in general, whatever thing he's talking about at the moment, whether he likes it or not. And he constantly tosses in shit like society tells this to these people, which is often unsubstantiated from his part and used so frequently that it's just a non-statement at this point. What society, Rudyard? What do you mean by that? You can't just say society and expect your unhinged and unsubstantiated claims to immediately make sense. We're not in fucking Gamergate anymore. Whatifalthist seems to think that he's already right. He doesn't need to justify himself. He's smart and logical after all. Anybody similarly gifted will arrive independently to his points, and everybody else is just an idiot. They can suck it, I guess. My favorite part in every red and black pill argument is of course talking about how society oppresses young men and blaming feminism for it, then talk about stereotypes and expectations that are specifically present because of men, toxic masculinity, and outdated ideals of how men should be, often things that feminism specifically wants to disassemble. Not yet, but I will talk about this, hopefully in the next video. Now on to the ugliest part of this whole mess. I left the most disgusting things for last, and that is saying something given how ignorant he is throughout the whole video. The first rough half of this nonsense tsunami can be dismissed as just stupid. However, as we advance towards the end, something much more sinister rears its ugly head. Plain old misogyny. There is no better word for it. Be it talking about the so-called traditional values, looks inside, 19th century Victorian British sexism.
Crashing birth rate, we will have to return to more historical, normal gender standards. In the incredibly rapid population growth of the 20th century, population growth was put at a low level of importance since it was occurring so rapidly anyway. However, as the world's population will start to plummet over the course of the 21st century, our culture will rapidly have to put a very heavy emphasis on family values.
Negative stereotypes, ignorance about how women are, a sign that he is actually not sharing a lot of company with women.
That being said, the left is not wise. It is in fact suicidally delusional. Another thing to keep track of is the two biggest influences young men have from women are porn and feminism. One of them makes them degrade women, seeing them as not respectable or as sex objects, while the other one is porn. The thing is, men hold the balance of actual physical force in society, and women have offset that over history by being kind and with sex. Men in general either view women as sex objects or wife material. Women, for reasons I don't understand, can't figure this out, and so portray themselves as one and expect to be treated as the other. Men tend to view women who aren't of marriage material with complete contempt. The thing is, we've removed the positive feminine from life. It's hard for women to understand how dangerous that is. Women are the humanizing force on men, and pulling out the chance of taking in the positive feminine will turn men absolutely violent. Men like violence, and if they're not incentivized against it, things are going to get really ugly.
To just naked sexism. Like how he uses the example of some random, unnamed and most likely scripted reality TV show cast having troubles in a survivor environment because they are women.
I remember there was this TV show where they tried to get a group of young men and young women to survive on an island by themselves. And what happened next was basically what you'd expect, where the young men did very well and the young women had to be rescued by the TV crew. And although this is silly, I think it's indicative of some underlying reality of the human condition.
Or that societal roles forced on women through history define what women can be today. The patriarchal revolutions, which I still don't know what they are supposed to be.
And what happens with these is that in a world that's barbaric, men install themselves as higher social status than women because they're more responsible for facing the threats of the outside world. And then as society gets safer, women's social status rises, and men are willing to do this because it helps the entire society and them in general. until what happens is the men have no incentive to cooperate in the society, and thus the society falls apart and the cycle restarts.
Because he never really explains, the only thing implied is that women having a good life, freedom, and any degree of influence destroys the society, and were needed because men are more responsible when facing threats, how sexual harassment becoming taboo is a bad thing, misrepresented as if dating would be taboo.
However, on top of that, picking up girls in places like parks or bookstores has become taboo alongside work. This leaves bars and nightclubs. The thing is that bars or clubs don't tend to attract good women and skew the odds against men in every possible way. The logic for nightclubs is to offer women attention as easily as possible, while lowering the chances a woman has to offer anything to the man, which is why women like them. Likewise, people say you can meet girls at community or friend groups, but as of now, there's an unspoken rule in a lot of these that you shouldn't date them, since it'll disturb the intricate friend networks which make up those communities.
How women have less to offer to men, do less activities for some fucking reason.
As well as that, women tend to just do less activities than men. Most young women just go to work and then go home. Homath then said one of the most blackpilling things in my life, with, I guess there's nowhere anymore.
While literally referencing blackpill, the misogynistic ideological cornerstone of the wider incel community in the process, or that women abdicated social responsibility.
The great irony here is that as women have gained more social power, they have used this to abdicate responsibility, which in turn makes them more fragile. The end point of modern feminism has been to abdicate responsibility for women. A woman can never have her feelings hurt on political topics, or intellectual ones, never feel awkward around men, socially, or held responsible in the failures of her own life.
And how men hold monopoly on violence and women should fear them.
It's very simple, in fact, that the group which holds power is taunting and removing any incentive for the group which has a monopoly on force or violence, that being young men. I can't believe it since it's so stupid. Don't taunt the bear. That being said, this young male revolt would be absolutely horrifying to witness. People return whatever they've been given in most times. Society has treated young men as subhuman for years, and so I expect the rebels to do the same to their enemies. We actually live in a profoundly non-moralistic culture in that we don't hold anyone to hard moral standards. What this means is that once the blood starts flowing, no one believes in moral standards enough to check their bloodlust. This war will be far less humane than the previous American Civil War or Revolution.
These are just a few examples of the more overtly sexist ideas that this Bolfatsan holds at his heart. What I especially find absolutely vile and egregious is his not-so-subtle threats of violence against women, that young men will remove the state's protection and then they will do horrifying things to women. And no, Whatifalthist, you in this video repeatedly associated yourself with incels. You are not just an outside observer who laments on what will happen if women are not returned to bondage. A disgusting thing in its own right. Whatifalthist rarely says the small text out loud, that the ultimate solution to this is literally dismantling women's rights. The only redeeming thing here would be if he's not a malicious raging misogynist as he presents himself, but just simply, as usual, an adult man whose mind is of an edgy teenager who doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. The Joker meme applies here, like society should fear us when we decide we will no longer play nice, which makes me physically cringe. There are numerous other examples too, some more subtle than overt. I would be here all day showing and explaining everything. There are things that I left out for the sake of time. I didn't mention his shitty and jarring editing style, for example, which seems to have not improved one bit during his more than decade-long existence on YouTube. He's a repeated offender in nonsense, so sometimes I give one example out of the numerous others to represent my problems with it, so me not talking about everything doesn't mean that the rest of the video from start to finish is not absolute garbage. Like, this video was supposed to be 10 minutes long. The problem with bullshit is that you need to spend much more energy on debunking it than it takes to create it. Moreover, Whatifalthist seem to be bad with people in general, not understanding that human factor that shapes societies and ideologies. He's deluding himself with shitty narratives, single-minded approaches that often make absolutely no sense. All in all, this was low-key one of the worst videos I've ever seen both within and without the topic. I felt a special need to make this response to it, as I was already submerged in the incel stuff and I've worked for months now to produce an overarching explanation on the issue, something it seems Whatifalthist either out of his own incompetence, laziness or malice completely failed at every level. I genuinely don't understand how anyone can take him seriously given his glaring issues, maybe because people are just suckers full of well-rounded narrative. There is also some personal reasons too. Like, he really annoys me by how much he reminds me of my 14-year-old self. Alas, I may be the idiot in that case, because I grew out of it, he made a successful career out of it. Again, this video is no excuse to harass him. If you harass him, you are worse than he is. You are worse than anything you imagine him to be. And back to you, Whatifalthist, or Rudyard if you like that name better, because I have a sinking suspicion that you have watched this video or it has been forwarded to you. I do not mean harm. I merely want you to learn out of your mistakes. I merely want you to admit that you now know better. But until then, we will ruthlessly dismantle the nonsense you are putting out there, because you are responsible for what you are doing. Thank you for coming to my unhinged rant. I was Kane, and I know exactly where you left your car keys, but I will not tell you.